at the forefront of politics.
Our enemy is Trump. He is the enemy. We gotta unite. If we're not a united party, we lose to Trump.
On the front lines of activism.
There's certain fights, if we don't engage, they win. This is a fundamental question of who we are.
And delivering your daily dose of comedy.
Donald Trump, when he had his physical, they had his blood pressure, and mine is higher than his. Oh. And the irony is mine is higher because of him.
From the blue wave.
We flipped. Enough seats to take control of the House. We control the House.
To 2020 and beyond. This is the Dean Obeidallah Show on Sirius XM Progress, Channel 127.
And welcome to the show, brothers and sisters. Tuesday, August 27th. I'm Dean Obeidallah, here to be your MBFF, waiting patiently for you. And passionately, I should say both, patiently and passionately, on Twitter at Dean Obeidallah. So, a lot of things to cover, but I want to talk about an issue that some of you know this person, some of you don't. But it makes a bigger point here, and I think it's a slower news day, so it's a perfect time to talk about this guy. And his name is Bret Stephens. I know Michael talked about him as well. I've long not been a fan of Bret Stephens for various reasons, but today something happened on Twitter, kind of exploded into the real world, Bret Stephens. And it made 2 points, and I'll tell you more about him in a second. He's a right-wing writer for the New York Times, but it made 2 big points. 2 big points. One is that conservatives love freedom of speech. They love freedom of speech unless they don't agree with what you're saying. Then they want you fired. That's one. 2, Bret Stephens is another example that if you're a conservative white male, you're graded on a curve. You can be mediocre. Be a conservative white male, you're mediocre, the media will love you. If you're a person of color, you got to work twice as hard to get even just nearly as much. And that's the truth. Bret Stephens is not an idiot. No. Is he a smart guy? Sure. Is he impressive? No. But does he have a New York Times contributorship and a MSNBC contributor? Yep. Are there people of color who are far smarter, far better? Yep. And they don't have that. That's the world we live in. So let's talk about Bret Stephens a little bit, because it makes these points, and I think it's important, even if it's just for us, to call out the hypocrisy of both the right and the power structure in this country, which elevates mediocre white right-wing men and makes people of color struggle that much harder. And this is the world we live in. So Bret Stephens, in case you don't know him, I'll give you some idea of some of the articles he's written and comments he's made before we get into the story of what he did today, to show you the hypocrisy. Because he's all about freedom of speech. He's all about say whatever you want. That's how it works. So in October 2017, Bret Stephens wrote an article defending Brett Kavanaugh even after Trump mocked Dr. Christine Ford at a rally. Remember that? Despicably mocked her. The headline for that article was, "For once, I'm grateful for Trump." And he goes on to say how it was so great that he stood up to these crazy voices on the left, meaning normal people and women. He is called the campus rape epidemic, in quotes, that's what he wrote it, an imaginary enemy. So campus rape of young girls on college campuses is an imaginary enemy. He suggested that anti-Semitism was a disease of the Arab mind. That's his quote. Because, of course, white supremacists are not Arab and they hate Jews, but they don't count because Bret Stephens doesn't like Arabs, doesn't like Muslims. This is a guy who wrote an article in March of this year for the New York Times. And the headline was, "Palestinian lives don't matter, asterisk." And then you go down there, it says, "unless Israel is to blame." And it was the same argument we hear when they attack Black Lives Matter and say, oh, you only care when it's a white cop. You don't care about black on black violence, which that is not true at all. You're making a bigger point about a structure we live in. And Stephens famously tweeted in 2017 about freedom of speech, "The right to offend is the most precious right. Without it, free speech is meaningless." And he's went on college campuses and given commencement addresses where he chided the college students for safe spaces and being afraid to hear the opposing side. So you get the idea. This is Bret Stephens, Mr. Champion of free speech. Say whatever you want. I got a thick skin. This is America. This is what it's about. Bring it, right? He's a little lower key than that. He's very low key. But that's his idea. So what happened? Here's the story of what happened to Bret Stephens. Yesterday, David Karp, who I don't know, no one really knows unless you go to George Washington University where he's an associate professor of media. Well, there was an article, a real article, on Twitter. New York Times says the New York Times newsroom was infested with bedbugs. That's the real story. It wasn't a joke. That was a real story. So David Karp, associate professor of GW, writes on Twitter that bedbugs are a metaphor that bedbugs are Bret Stephens. Clearly, it's a joke. He's not even calling him a bedbug. He's saying it's a metaphor for Bret Stephens as a bedbug at the New York Times newsroom, because he doesn't like Bret Stephens, because Bret Stephens also on policy horrible, the climate change. He defends apologists. He defends people who do not believe in climate change over scientists. He defends them. So you get an idea of how right-wing he is, even though he's an intellectual right-wing guy, not like a fire-breathing Rush Limbaugh type. So David Karp writes that the bedbugs are a metaphor. The bedbugs are Bret Stephens. The tweet gets literally 9 likes on Twitter. If you're on Twitter, you know what that means. No one retweeted it. No big deal. It doesn't go viral. No one's talking about it. But somehow Bret Stephens finds this Twitter account and sees it and sends an email to Bret Stephens sends an email to David Karp saying, I would welcome the opportunity for you to come to my home, meet my wife and kids, talk to us for a few minutes, and then call me a bedbug to my face. That would take some genuine courage and intellectual integrity on your part. So first of all, you got Bret Stephens there going from like, a guy says you're metaphorically a bedbug, and he says, I dare you to come to my house and say it to my face, which is like 6th grade talk when you're on the school ground. Somebody, I don't like what you're saying. Yeah, say it to my face, tough guy. This guy is a Pulitzer Prize winning writer for the New York Times, MSNBC contributor, telling a guy, come to my house, say it to my face. That's one thing. That's kind of scummy. But here's the biggest scum part. And this shows the hypocrisy and the intellectual dishonesty of Bret Stephens. That email he sent, he didn't just send it to the professor, David Karp. He also sent it to the guy's boss at George Washington University, the provost, clearly hoping to get him fired for saying simply the word bedbug. Metaphorically, you're a bedbug. And the Professor Karp told Washington Post, he not only thinks I should be ashamed of what I wrote, he thinks I should get in trouble for it. That's an abuse of power. And then today, Bret Stephens was on MSNBC, where he's a contributor. And let's be honest, let me be blunt for a second here. Bret Stephens is not even close to countless people we have who are not contributors who come on our show, or you see on MS and CNN who don't get paid. From Elie Mystal to Daniel Moody Mills to Tiffany Cross, and the list goes on and on and on. Far smarter, far more engaging, far better on television, far more persuasive than Bret Stephens. But mediocre white men, there's a curve to them. So today, here he is listen to this intellectual dishonesty. Listen to Bret Stephens. Don't forget, he sent a letter to the professor and copied the guy's boss. You only copy someone's boss when you want them fired or suspended or silenced. That's what you do it for, generally to get them fired. So here's Bret Stephens on MSNBC. Clip number 1.
Yesterday, a professor at George Washington University described me as a bedbug or a metaphorical bedbug, just in the context of the New York Times having a bedbug problem in our building. And I think that kind of rhetoric is dehumanizing and totally unacceptable, no matter where it comes from. So I wrote him a personal email. I didn't go to Twitter. I wrote him a personal email, which I think was very civil, saying that I didn't appreciate it, that I would welcome him to come to my home in New York, meet with my family, and see if he would call me a bedbug to my face, because a lot of the things people say on social media aren't the things they're really prepared to say in one-on-one interactions. I also copied his provost on the note. People are upset about this. I want to be clear. I had no intention whatsoever to get him in any kind of professional trouble.
Oh my God. I just randomly copied his boss. I didn't want to get in professional trouble. I just found out where his boss is, found out the guy's email. It's not easy. Who knows who the provost is GW and their email? You got to research that. He found out who's the guy's boss, found his email, sent the email, copied the boss, and then he goes on, Bret Stephens should be fired for that. I'm not calling for him to be fired, but he should be fired for lying on MSNBC, intellectual dishonesty. So he goes, I didn't want to get him in trouble. I mean, I just randomly copied his boss. This is what you do. I don't want to get him in trouble. But then Bret Stephens, he continues on to actually undermine that very point by going, I did want to get him in trouble. This is off the charts. Here's clip number 2.
But it is the case that the New York Times and other institutions that people should be aware, managers should be aware of the way in which their people, their professors or journalists interact with the rest of the world. That's certainly the case with me at the New York Times. My editors are always aware of what I'm saying, and I've sometimes been called to account, rightly so. He then posted my email on Twitter, so people are free to go and look at what I had to say. all I would say is that using dehumanizing rhetoric like bed bugs or, analogizing people to insects is always wrong. We can do better. We should be the people on social media that we are in real life.
He's got to be kidding me. So he did want to get him in trouble. He called the language of referring to him as a metaphorical bedbug, not a real bedbug, but metaphorically bedbugs, the dehumanizing. He went on to equate it to totalitarian regimes, sort of like Nazis or Mussolini and stuff like that, which is just ridiculous, off the chart stuff. And I mean, think about it. If you were a reporter, if you were a radio host, a TV anchor, and you sent an email saying, I dare you to come to my house and say that to my face, do you think you might get in trouble if you're a person of color and you say that? What do you think? Of course you would. But not when you're a white conservative, you're not. And this is the same Bret Stephens, who in 2017 gave a commencement address at Hampden City College. Never heard of it? All-men's school in Southern Virginia. And there he told his students how important freedom of speech is, telling them about safe spaces, mocking safe spaces, saying, if it's not okay to say certain things anywhere, should we even think them? Wouldn't we be better off if the ideas that can't hurt people's feelings or trigger their anxieties never even popped into our heads in the first place? He was being sarcastic there, saying the idea that you should not even be allowed to think these things if you can't say them. So his point is, of course you should be able to say things. And he went on to say about defending those vile speakers that many people don't want at their colleges, saying things that in the name of being safe, it is becoming increasingly difficult for campus administrators to guarantee the physical safety of controversial visiting speakers. Like white nationalists and Milo and garbage people like that. And it continued on to tell these students, 2017, here is my advice to you. Get out of your own safe spaces. Enhance your tolerance for discordant voices. Narrow your criteria for what's beyond the pale. So his lesson to these students is, hey, have a thick skin, never be upset. In the real world, Bret Stephens tries to get a guy fired for literally using a term bedbug in a tweet and talking about it metaphorically. Look, I love free speech. I wish that the worst thing I was ever called on Twitter or by anybody for an article I wrote was a bedbug. In fact, I was not. That's not it. For me, if it was neo-Nazis who literally wanted to kill me for mocking Donald Trump, their beloved Donald Trump. Countless women also shared the comments they've been called on Twitter by vile people. Some of the vile people that Bret Stephens would defend and say should speak on a college campus, where they got threats of rape and called vulgar, the C word, and horrible things. Women were sharing that, saying, Bret Stephens, this is what we've been called. You're talking about civility. And then Stephens went on to say he deactivated his Twitter account and he posted that Twitter is a sewer. It brings out the worst in humanity. No, Bret Stephens. And this, again, the hypocrisy of the right. They're all about personal responsibility. But he takes no responsibility. He blames Twitter for vile comments he's made on Twitter. No. It doesn't bring out the worst in humanity. It's bringing out who you are. If you're vile and you go on Twitter and you think, I can be this vicious person, that's who you really are. That's who you're showing us. So don't play games. Don't blame Twitter for you showing your inhumanity and you being vile to people. So my point is here, because I think it's important to call out. And yes, I don't like Bret Stephens. Full disclosure. Anti-Palestinian views, anti-Muslim views, don't like the guy. It's not a discussion over policy. But still, in the overarching picture here, there's a guy like Bret Stephens. He's one of a countless number of right-wingers who love to talk about free speech. Tucker Carlson, Ben Shapiro, the list goes on. And they talk about in the context of being able to demonize minorities and ridicule and demean people. But the minute you say something they don't like, they have no problem trying to get you fired, literally fired, for saying something they don't agree with. And again, the biggest point here is that white male conservatives are graded on a curve. If you're a conservative, white male, media outlets love you. You could be mediocre, and the people of color got to work twice as hard, and women have to work even harder. If you're a woman of color, you have to work even harder. That's the real world we live in right here. So, to me, it's just another example of where we are in this country. And I want to continue to call out the right. And people say, why do you do it? Is it a fool's errand? It might be. But I think we have to do it. I think it's important to us. So, look, I'd love to hear from you. There's some other topics to talk about. There was an unbelievable story about Bill Barr, the Attorney General, having a holiday party we just found out a short time ago at the Trump White House, at the Trump Hotel, in D.C. to make profit. I'll give you details of that when we come back. That's on top of wanting to have the G7 summit next year at his own private golf course. So there's so much going on, but I wanted to talk about Bret Stephens for a little bit. I'd love to get your reaction. You're my guest. We'll come back. We'll talk about this. I'll brief you on what's going on with Bill Barr. It is literally the swamp monster come to life, getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And Trumpers don't even care. They don't care because to them, Trump is king. 866-997-4748. Give me a call. Be right back. Progressive values are the best of American values, and we need to keep fighting for them to save our country.
Don't go anywhere.